Welcome. It's so good to see everyone signing on, and Nancy, hi.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for the invite.
No problem. I'm actually having a little bit of sound issue.
Okay. I'm going to make sure my sound is up.
Okay, great. Now it's all good.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
And
I
then
think so.
you
No, something's going on.
closer.
There
it is. Okay.
I'm going to unmute myself now. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. That makes a big difference. So, as we wait for people to come on, I wanted to welcome everyone. And if everyone would want to put themselves on camera, that would be great. It's so much easier for me to communicate that way. It feels a lot more personal, but I understand sometimes if that's not possible. We have a large group today, almost 60 people registered, and that is very exciting. The attendance at these Zoom conversations keeps increasing, and that's really lovely. Hi, Mary. It's nice to see you. And we have a really diverse audience today. We have people from grief centers, hospice centers, so different social service agencies, organ donation related organizations, hospitals, and friends, family, and many who are either caring for someone right now or who have cared for someone in the past. So, if you'd like, while we're waiting to put in why you decided to come today, what you'd like to learn, or where you're from, that would be wonderful. And if everyone could put themselves on mute, that would be great as well. So where's everyone coming from? You want to learn something from me. That's very lovely. San Diego, that's great. Hi, Bonnie. Nice to see you too. Okay. Well, so I want to respect everyone's time today. And so I'm going to welcome everyone again now that a lot of people have come on. I'm Susan Angel Miller, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today with Joy Loverde about feeling grief and loss while caring for those we love. The next hour and 15 minutes will look something like this. I'll introduce myself and share my story briefly, and why I believe these conversations are so important. I'll introduce Joy, and we'll talk about her experiences and insights in the elder care industry. And then we'll leave the last 20 to 30 minutes open for questions, and you'll be able to put in your questions in the chat, and we will curate through them and answer as many as we can possibly do. I love that interaction. It's actually my favorite part of these conversations. And I'll let you know when the right time to put those chats in the chat box will be. So because we have a large audience, if you could make sure you put yourself on mute to avoid distractions, feel free to turn your cameras on so I can be looking right at you and feeling like we're in the same room together. And we'll just go at it right now then. So many of you know me, but more and more of the people that are coming onto these calls, I don't know, and that's exciting in itself because I get to spread my story and our message about grief to more people. So my story started in 2009 in January when my 14-year-old daughter, Laura, was a freshman at Nicolet High School. She was she was at the end of her first semester and studying for exams and history and science fair, and she started complaining about headaches. And we thought, okay, you know, she's 14, headaches are a common complaint. You know, I wasn't too worried. We talked to the pediatrician. She said, give her Tylenol, et cetera, et cetera. But the headaches didn't go away. And about 3 weeks later, she had a brief neurological exam that went fine. And on a Wednesday morning, she had slept in my bed the night before, and she woke up and she threw up several times. She asked me why I had 4 eyes. And within the next hour, she had a seizure in the upstairs hallway. So we called 911. They came, they revived her, and we rushed her to the hospital where they had a CT scan, and a doctor that I didn't know came in and told me that Laura had a mass at the back of her head. Well, so I was there just with a friend. My husband had been traveling, and I just remember sitting back in my chair, surprised at the diagnosis, but thinking, okay, it's going to be removed, and everything's going to be okay. She'll recover. And we can have my second daughter's bat mitzvah that was scheduled in 10 days. I just thought, you know, this is a bump in the road. Everything's going to be okay, because that's how things happened in our family. We have 2 other daughters, Sarah and Rachel. My husband and I have known each other for since high school. We live in a suburb of Milwaukee. You know, things had always gone fine for us. Well, it wasn't to be that way in this case, because later that afternoon, she was transferred to a regular room, and the headaches continued to get worse. They told us that she would have surgery to remove the brain tumor on Friday in 2 days. But by the end of the evening, my husband were in her room, and the pain was getting to be a lot. And all of a sudden she stopped breathing. So they rushed her down to put a shunt in to try to remove the pressure. And basically, the next thing we knew, we were up in the ICU room with all the sounds and all the machines hooked up to her. And as a mom, I just kind of immediately knew that this was really bad, and I could really feel that she wasn't there anymore. You fast forward 3 days later, and I mean, she was in school on a Tuesday afternoon, had not been in the hospital at all. So this was really sudden, out of the blue, not to be expected. And 4 days later, after she had been hooked up to these machines, they told us what we had feared but didn't want to admit, is that she was legally brain dead. So here, this is our oldest daughter and very special child, as we all have special children. And this is what we had to face on Saturday morning, February 21st of 2009. So as you can imagine, we were in this shock of grief, and we've learned quite a lot in the past almost 14 years about how grief illiterate our society is. And we had to learn how to go from being a private family to being a very public family in suburban Milwaukee, where everyone knows each other. And it took a lot of courage to figure out, how do I go out into the world again, parent our 2 other children, and face all of the uncomfortableness that surrounds grief and death. There was no book that we could look to tell us what to do, what not to do. And we really didn't want to live the next 4 or 5 decades of our life without Laura. It seemed unfathomable, but we had 2 other daughters who were 9 and 12 at the time that we needed to take care of. So, I mean, this is a very condensed version, as you can imagine. One of the ways that I healed was by talking to as many people as I could, friends, acquaintances, strangers, that I would just meet at Trader Joe's, you know, that kind of thing. And I also then started writing, and it took me about, I don't know, 5 to 10 years to write down the entire story, because it was important for me to record what had happened, and then to share the messages that I had learned, because our culture, as we all know, doesn't do death well. And so that's one of the reasons I'm doing these Permission to Thrive conversations, is I want to model that even the worst things can happen, and we still have that ability to choose how we respond to those bad events in our life. I really want to normalize the topic of grief. So let me see where I'm at now. One of the things that helped us survive was that we had our proverbial ducks in a row, and we had relationships in the community, we had resources, we had good relationships. And those are some of those things that I think we should keep in the back of our mind when we talk about this caregiving concept, because these two concepts are really intertwined. So for the last 18 months, I've been hosting these virtual conversations. First, it was a way to connect during COVID when I couldn't be in front of people. And now it's become a way to share in a very easy way experts and authors from around the country who I can showcase and share their wisdom with you as well. So the topics have ranged everything from empathy, grief, resilience, organ donation, the whole range. And even though now I'm back speaking in person in certain situations, I still feel the need to continue these, because it's such a low barrier for people to talk about the things that are really difficult to talk about otherwise. So I connected with Joy about a year ago through a mutual friend, Nancy Barnett, and I really appreciate her her connecting us. And even though caregiving is not something that I typically talk about, what we found is that there's a lot of connections between the two topics. And I thought it was really interesting to explore on both of our sides, because we're both learning from each other. While we're having this conversation, we're going to be learning just alongside of you. And this is a very personal topic for me, actually, because in the last 4 months, I've lost my brother-in-law and my father-in-law, who were both being cared for by my sister-in-law and mother-in-law. And both my sister-in-law and mother-in-law are on the call today. And I'm very appreciative that they decided to join me. They were both incredible caregivers and went through a lot in the time when when my sister-in-law's husband was in failing health, and then just recently with my father-in-law, who had health problems and then ended up having some dementia. And I saw firsthand how complicated and confusing those emotions can be while you're caring for someone who eventually or imminently are going to pass. So this is where Joy comes in, and I'm very thankful for her generosity in talking with us today. Joy is the best-selling author of The Complete Elder Care Planner and Who Will Take Care of Me When I'm Old. She's a seasoned keynote speaker and media spokesperson. She has been on the Today Show, CBS Early Show, ABC News, NPR, and more. She's been quoted in many publications, and USA Today ran a 4-part series on her employee elder care programs. She works with professionals as a mature market consultant. She's just been described to me as caring, family-oriented, and professional. But I would add that she's also extremely generous with her time and expertise, and very knowledgeable about her life's work. So welcome, Joy. I'm going to try to put you on, to pin you up here so that everyone can see you.
Thank you.
And I wanted to welcome you and thank you again for doing this.
You're welcome. I wouldn't be anywhere else. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. I've been doing interviews for over 30 years, Susan, and no one has ever engaged me in this conversation about grief and caregiving while the person we care for is alive and amongst us. No one. Yeah. That's how incredibly important your insights are. And so congratulations. I'm honored and very much looking forward to seeing how this all unfolds.
Wonderful. Wow. And that actually brings up the unfortunate issue that even geriatric social workers and counselors, nurses, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, people that you think are way up a learning curve when it comes to grief, death, and loss, you find that they've had little to no education in these areas. And so what we're talking about here, I find that we're educating people about the ABCs of grief when you would think that our society would be much more evolved. So Joy, let me just start out by asking you, how did you get into this field of elder care? And, what's your experience been during your life's work?
Well, this is all going to get intertwined with why we're here today. So I was a 14-year-old high schooler. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, and Sister Dorothy marched into the room when I was a freshman and said, okay, who's going to the nursing home with me on Thanksgiving morning? And I raised my hand. What I was looking for was a way to get extra credit. That's it. No idea what I was doing. Sister Dorothy and I go to the nursing home on Thanksgiving morning. I see it, Susan, as though it were yesterday. 7 people are sitting in the dark on Thanksgiving morning. No one's laughing, no one's smiling, no one's talking, and they're just staring at me. And that woke me up. I said to myself, how did these people get here? What did they do or what did they not do to be in this situation? And how in the world can I help? Now I'm 14. I really have a lot more going on in my life in terms of finishing school and making a name and progress for myself. Old people are not on my radar, and yet I couldn't get this picture out of my mind. Fast forward when I turned 40 and I had a daughter of my own and a career of my own, I knew that those questions could no longer be avoided. And that's when I wrote the first edition of the Complete Elder Care Planner. The mission of that book is very simple. Get families to start talking to each other. And that was it. And the rest is history.
Well, that's a lot. That's a lot to absorb right there. And in fact, it's interesting because I imagine at times people have said to you, wow, elder care, I'm not sure that that's the sexiest, most lighthearted area of work to go into. And I know that people say that about me, how can you do this? Isn't this so emotional? And I find that it becomes part of your DNA, and you begin to understand that these types of bad things happen in our lives, and they will happen in everyone's lives. And once you get past the point of being scared of growing older and also eventually dying or your family members dying, it kind of releases something in you that you can then be the educator for others. So
That's exactly right. It's
exactly
right. You can't explain the wonderful moments of elder care when people are in the throes of it and haven't gone through all of the emotions.
I think people would be surprised at both of our social media feeds, because mine is not about Britney Spears. It's about grief and loss and some very, very difficult topics. And I'm sure yours is the same way.
Right.
Grief is the elephant in the room here. And maybe you can explain, when you deal with senior living coordinators and the actual people that are caring for their loved ones, what do they tell you about how they're experiencing grief, or, what are their stories like?
Oh, their stories are all over the map. One of the most common reactions and experiences to grief in the caregiving setting, believe it or not, is anger. So here's how it tends to show up, and I see it all the time. We typically see the person that we care so much about, and we begin to make demands. Mom, I think you should move closer. Dad, you got to quit driving. Grandpa, why don't you exercise more? And we don't say it with necessarily with love in our heart. We're demanding and almost angry that they're not doing what we say they should be doing. Well, this is hidden grief. We're trying so hard to get them to do something that will stop them from doing what we know, as you called the elephant in the room. We all know how the story ends. So anger is one of the most common things that I have witnessed in the presence of people who are making their best attempts to take care of their loved ones. They get angry. Other people, interestingly enough, think that they are a victim of this whole thing. People who are victimizing, a lot of self-pity. That this aging process is happening to them. That it's all about them. You're going to be leaving me behind, and I can't stop crying about it. And so this self-pity, this victimization of this whole caregiving setting is really common. You also see it in ways where people are overprotective. So many times I'll be in a hospital setting where there are so many IVs attached to the person, and somebody can't let go, and they feel guilty about the fact that the person is there. This is all grief. Grief just shows up in a variety of very human, raw, emotional ways.
So what you are explaining, I mean, it's so interesting because the person is still living, and these feelings of grief are permeating, but yet because the person hasn't died yet, the caregiver isn't really getting acknowledged for all of those emotions. They're not getting they're not getting the flowers. They're not getting potentially the help that they need.
Right. No, it's the elephant in the room. Nobody's saying what's going on here over and over again. There's no place to put these unspoken emotions. So what comes out in a lot of ways, there's a lot of, in the case of dementia caregivers, you see it in expressions of hopelessness, helplessness. They can't get closure on these deep senses of loss. I mean, in the present moment, grief looks like helplessness and hopelessness so very often, because grief is the elephant in the room. Nobody has ever mentioned that word.
Oh, and do the people that are caring for their loved ones understand this, or they're just dealing with the in-moment frustrations and challenges of the day?
Oh yes, that's all it is. It's just trying to deal with anger, guilt, helplessness, just pity. We hear. So unless somebody stops the insanity of it and is willing, but it usually has to be somebody who's really good. But thank God there's so many professionals on this call, because those are the people who can guide us at the very moment. They probably do understand that grief is the presence here, but who is professional enough and skilled enough to get the conversation into the emotions into the room where they belong, including the person who is being cared for. That person is typically that person's grief. God only knows what they get to do, because nobody's validating that either.
Right. So it's sort of like you have both people here. You have the person who's dying and has to deal with the reality of that in their future, and then you have the person caring for them. And it reminds me of the 5 stages of grief that's been so popularized by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I don't know if people, I'm sure that many of you on the call have heard about this, and it's become this like oversized myth about grief and dying. And what I learned while I was researching my book is that this has been this research that she did was just misunderstood, and that she was doing all of this research on the stages of grief, and she was doing it on people who were dying. So they were having the anger and the denial and the bargaining and the acceptance. Those were the stages for the person who was themselves dying. It wasn't about a person who was in grief. And so, and even for the person who's dying, I don't think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross ever created her research in order for it to be these linear steps, as if it's a linear process. You have to go through the anger in order to get to the denial and the bargaining and the acceptance and all that. It's, so many of the image that I see I think about grief and is like not a linear arrow pointing one direction or another, but it's like messy scribbling from a child, right? It's like a maze that you can't figure out which way is which, because it keeps shifting in different ways. And so I think it's really important to see that there's both the person who's caregiving and the person who's dying, and neither one follows any type of pre-planned. There's no guidebook for this, and that's what makes it so confusing.
Or it's what makes it so ripe for a new creation of a relationship between the two people. That's the way I look at it.
That's lovely. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so it kind of goes back to my method of being in the presence of this kind of thing, whether someone's dying or not. Dying is not, grief and dying are not the overall themes of caregiving. It's just being loving and concerning about somebody else. But then everybody goes every which way, right? And there's no, like you said, linear formula here. What are my options? Ask questions and listen. That's it. Not lead anybody on to what I think should be done. Not ask the kind of questions that are leading, like, well, what do you plan to do about it? No. What's going on? I'm here to listen. How can I be helpful? This is in the presence. Aren't we all dying? Aren't we all in a confusing life situation? Aren't we all trying to manage 65 things at once? Who can we be for each other? One of the questions I love to ask, and this comes from one of the women on the call, Jill Morris. She's a coach and a person who has taught me so much about choice, is who can I be right now? Who can I be right now to this person? And that is where I have, it takes work, but I'm learning to be better at who can I be in this moment with this person.
And I think that resonates with me on so many levels, because it's the same thing that I learned when I was grieving Laura. Is I appreciated the people that came over and sat with me, or cleaned out my refrigerator, or took my 9-year-old to Chuck E. Cheese. They figured out what I needed, and they asked me, and they gave me choices of what I wanted or when I wanted to do it. A friend would text me and ask, do you want to take a walk on Tuesday or Thursday, 10:30 or noon? And that made all the difference, because it allowed me to be able to say yes, because there was a choice. There was a choice, and it wasn't like I had to. I couldn't say no. It was much harder to say no. And I think what you're saying is that, and you have to do what you feel comfortable doing. If someone wanted to bake me a challah or a lasagna, and that's what they like doing, you know, chicken soup, and that they liked cooking, then that's what I would appreciate. But if someone just wanted to sit with me, or someone wanted to
Mhm.
help me with gardening or whatever, you know, you have to be the person that you are in the situation.
That's right. That's exactly right. I don't, it's just, I think one of the reasons why this has never come up before is because this is one of the most uncomfortable situations we can find ourselves in. That it is really all of us get out of our comfort zone under this circumstance, all of us.
Well, I find it really, never talked about this idea that you've really never talked about grief when it comes to caregiving. And that is kind of blowing my mind right now, because to me, the two are so interrelated. Well, and so maybe this is the good segue to talk about anticipatory grief, which is like this, I learned about David Kessler last summer. He's an author of a very popular grief expert. He wrote a book called The Sixth Stage of Grief. He had actually worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I got grief certified, you know, to be an educator on grief through him. And one of the things he talks about are the many different types of grief that are out there. You know, there's like unacknowledged grief if you're infertile. There's complicated grief if it really just it keeps going on forever, or it involves someone who died that you had a very complicated relationship. There's ambiguous grief. There's anticipatory grief. There's, you know, not that any one grief can be labeled a certain way, but it helps you kind of understand that not every grief looks the same. And anticipatory grief is something that we connected on, Joy, when we first started talking about this program. You know, you are in grief, but the person hasn't passed away yet.
Yeah, and it's there. And like I mentioned earlier, instead of calling it what it is, it comes out in anger or helplessness or whatever. But it's really like trying to juggle these feelings that are foreign because the person is alive.
Right. Well, and you know, when my mother was, my mother also was taking care of my dad for several years when he had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and then had some dementia. And, you know, there's this concept of almost you're mourning the person at every stage along the way while they're becoming a different person than they used to be. Right. So,
yes.
I mean, that just seems integral to this whole concept. And I often wonder, you know, if you mourn the person all along the way, you know, does that make it any easier when they've died, or it's just unique to the situation?
I think it's unique to the situation depending on the relationship. At least that's been my personal experience. I can't speak for anybody else.
Right.
In some cases, it's one way. In some cases, it's another. And I think that's an important point you bring up, because
and I
there's
think,
no pattern.
Right. There's no pattern. And I think that there's also a suddenness to death, no matter how much it's expected and thought about and obsessed about, is when you get that call that something happens, it's still extremely sudden and unexpected and shocking. And you know, my experience with Laura was so out of the blue, so unexpected, so ridiculous, in the sense that you can have a child be in school complaining about their Spanish homework on one day, and basically by the end of the next day be considered brain dead. I mean, it just doesn't happen, but it happened. And I think what I've learned over the last 14 years is that, like, I now understand the other part of reality that I felt protected from before. You know, and somehow we felt we had been protected because we did all the right things as a family, and we lived by the rules, and we gave to charity, and we, whatever those rules are that you think are going to protect yourself. And what we realize is none of that's just our social construct, and that the people on the news, the stories of people on the news that you hear of car crashes and shooting victims, and yes, those could be me. And I was the news story at that. We were the news story at that point, and we had to just figure out, how do you move one step in front of the other. So,
Right. So grieving is sometimes we don't have an opportunity, is what you're describing. It's like, wait a minute,
yes.
both my parents died suddenly. No chance. Your daughter died suddenly. No chance to grieve. Boom, alive, dead. That's the end of the story. It's what, like you said, we're protected until we're not. But once we're not protected, other things evolve that bring awareness. To me, is always a good thing, right?
Yes.
You can't take away these experiences, and how we choose to be with them then guides us for the rest of our lives.
You put that very well. And you also, we would get lots of questions, which I'm sure many of you have had in different situations, where, people would say, well, aren't you sad that you weren't able to say goodbye to Laura? Like, you know what? First of all, I didn't have a choice. It wasn't like I was given, 3 boxes to choose from. And so you have to start creating a narrative that says, I wouldn't have wanted to have to say goodbye to a 14-year-old. Like, what would you say? Right? I mean, it was lovely that we had such a loving relationship before, so I didn't have to regret what our relationship, could have been before. But no matter what, I wouldn't have wanted to say goodbye. But it's an interesting point of, how do you create that narrative, no matter how the death occurs, no matter how the relationship was before the death? How do you create a narrative that you can live with going forward? And it's almost like I literally had to pick up my pen and write our story out to craft a narrative and an identity that would change with what had happened to me. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. You took a path that was right for you. Everyone, if they choose, will take a path of turning it into something they can use as a tool, because life is never the same after the first person you love dies, or your goldfish. I don't care what it is. It could be the dog. We're never the same after that. And how we go forward then takes on all kinds of very interesting perspectives and actions, which is why when we're around other people who have their own experiences, this is why the Death Cafe concept, I don't know if you've heard of it, very popular.
Maybe explain it to the people that
Sure.
might not have.
So since we live in a culture that doesn't have much of an awareness or willingness to discuss death, there are people who are taking a cue from overseas and bringing the Death Cafe to the United States. Basically what it is, it's a place, a predetermined place where people gather with the intention of discussing death. No agenda. You just come into the room. Usually they're drinking tea and having cake. That's the term cafe. And there is a facilitator who just facilitates the conversation. No one knows where it's going to go, and no one knows, exactly what's going to take place. These death cafes are all over the United States and the world. All you have to do is Google it, and you can find one if you're interested in talking about death. Of course, grief is a part of that conversation. The questions that happen during the Death Cafe are incredibly creative. Here's one for you that I don't even know what to think of it. So one person, I was at a deaf cafe, and one person said, "Do people who have Alzheimer's know they're dying?" And then the room went wild, and everybody put in their 2 cents and talked about that question. These are the kinds of things that give all of us the freedom to even enter a room where people are open-minded, and people from all walks of life, from the spiritual leaders all the way up to doctors, which is great, and everybody in between.
I think that's important to share, that there are creative ways that people are starting to address the topics of death and grief. I mean, you know, during COVID, there were many articles that talked about this is collective grief. We experienced, the entire world experienced collective grief and collective trauma. People that had never experienced loss experienced it in different ways, whether it was a parent who died, whether it was a loved one in a nursing home where they couldn't visit, whether it was their high school graduation that they couldn't attend, whether their job got they couldn't see, whatever. There's so many ways that we experienced trauma during COVID. And I think that if 1 million people died during COVID, and say 9 or 10 people were touched by that person that died, we have an extra 10 million people in this, I think it's the country, 1 million people died. It's a lot of extra grief and a lot of extra mental health issues that are surrounding us right now. So let me, turn to a little bit more of each death is unique, and there's no one prescription for how to deal with it, but there are definitely healthy and non-healthy ways of going through it. And I was just curious if you had any, to remind us of what those types of healthy coping mechanisms are when you're caregiving.
Well, again, I can only speak for myself, and I'm proud to admit all of my vulnerabilities and my being extremely fragile at any given time, because I am literally surrounded by people who die all the time. My friends are in their 90s. My family is old. So there at any given time, the phone rings and poof, and I'm getting to that age where it's starting to be more, my friends are calling me to tell me. So it's inescapable at this point. And I have, the tears for me flow freely, whether I'm on the phone with a friend or in front of a group of strangers when I'm giving a keynote speech. So the tears are never held back, because I have to be an influencer of not being afraid to cry. So many times people are wiping their tears away and say, I'm sorry. I never say that. So crying, the tears flow freely. That's one of the things that I do. Another thing that I do is, when I'm in the presence of someone that I care about, I shut everything else out, and I'm in the present moment with them. And if some of the people that I am with have dementia, and many of them do, I'm right there with them. Never saying you said that, or that's not reality or whatever. I go with the flow, and I'm in the present moment with everyone, whether they're 10 or 110. I have begun to value the present moment like nobody's business. It's all I care about. Another thing that I do is, I always end a meeting with someone or a phone call with "I love you." And I don't expect them to say "I love you" back, but I just want them to know that they are loved in case something happens. And I can't tell you how many phone calls I have had with my older friends who I never heard from again. "I love you." And then I can hear them on the other end just, smiling, or sometimes they say, I love you back.
Don't-
Um,
I can tell your mind is just, you have so many. Is there
yeah,
another one? Is there another one that you?
well, this way of being has had an incredible effect on the clean out process, and everybody can relate to what that means. So when someone dies, we have to go into their homes and clean it out. Now, to me, because of the relationships I've established, I actually could go into that environment in an entirely different mindset, where there's more joy, where there's absolute peace, where the laughter is flowing, and my ability to be with their stuff and in the air they breathed, that has totally changed everything.
I think that is so interesting. And I found that, you know, even in the first couple of weeks after Laura passed away, someone came up to me and she must have caught me smiling. And I felt actually what the comment was is, don't worry, Susan, you'll smile again one day. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks, because I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I've already smiled. I've even laughed in the time since Laura passed away, because people were around all the time and they're telling stories, and we were reminiscing about Laura. And so, but all of a sudden it's this feeling of not only guilt that my daughter died, how can I be laughing and smiling?
Mm-hmm.
And also it kind of gave this ceiling to my future happiness. Like, oh my gosh, you're telling me that one of these days I'll smile again, as if that's the best it'll get. And so, so it reminds me also of the humor that kind of comes into the most darkest moments, even when you're dealing with someone with, you know, advanced stage dementia or a advanced medical diagnosis. I found dark humor in a lot of things. And I find that the dark humor and the tragedy and the loss, they go hand in hand. And it's really sometimes the only way that you can relieve that incredible tension that exists. You know, that icky feeling in your throat that's like wants to bubble out of you, and you just, there's nothing else you can do but just get it out there. And in fact, one of the situations I ran into is I was at Trader Joe's in the checkout line like 6 weeks after Laura died. And the poor, you know, person behind the desk asked me what I was doing that weekend. Have you ever had that situation where they kind of pry a little bit too much? And I looked up the ceiling and saw that there was no one in line. And I just went, oh no, I don't think I'm going to be doing anything because my daughter passed away a couple of weeks ago. And I mean, that guy is never going to ask that question again.
That's right.
But it definitely relieved my tension at that moment.
I had a funny situation. I was going to my father's funeral, and I live in an apartment building in Chicago, and I was all dressed up in this gorgeous black suit and makeup on and the whole 9 yards. And this guy came in and he says, God, you look great. I said, good. I'm going to my dad's funeral.
Exactly.
Yeah, like that.
Sometimes you can't predict how the maudlin and the mundane come together.
I've decided it's all okay. And he didn't feel uncomfortable, and I had a good laugh out of it.
Exactly. I mean, then I'll be one more story and then we'll go on to questions. But the night before Laura's funeral, the limousine driver actually called our house and wanted to know what sandwiches we wanted in the limousine going to the funeral. To the point it was like, do you want, you know, mustard and mayonnaise and pickle? And it just felt so ridiculous, but it was something that we just had to get through. So I'm just gonna, this is a great time for anyone, if you want to put questions or comments in the chat room. And I'll just start with some of the ones that we have already, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. So one of them is, you know, how would you recommend we help people realize that they cannot control what's happening to the dying, infirm person and for the caregiver? Where can there be an invitation to let down, let go, accept? And I'll give this one to Joy.
when um, when I'm in the presence of the person who is witnessing the dying process of someone else, I have found you don't have to say much. This is not a time to talk and be wise. This is a time to be. And all we can do is create trust by not talking, and in that way we convey not being judgmental. I think being judged at a time where we're the one that's like out of our mind because the person we love is dying is one of the worst feelings we get when we're in that situation. So I kind of know this when I'm in the room with my friends who are dealing with their dying loved ones. And my presence allows them to come a little bit forward. If they inch towards me and I'm just sitting there being quiet and saying, I'm here if you want to talk. If the trust has been established, there's not much to say, but there is the question, is there anything you want to talk about?
It's lovely. And again, it's so similar to what I've learned about what you, guidance for how do you deal with a person who's in grief. And it's basically show up for the person, right? Don't ignore them, especially if you're a good friend or a family member, even if it's uncomfortable for you. Right. And so show up, listen and don't judge based on what you would think you would be like in that situation. And then the last piece is don't fix, because you can't. And I think that's what makes us so uncomfortable about going and seeing the person who's dying or going to console the person who's lost a child, is we can't imagine what that would be being in their situation. And we just want to snap our fingers and bring that person back. And we can't. And so it's another total example of how these same emotional intelligence is needed for both being with the person who's losing someone and being with the person who's lost somebody.
I can give you an example of something that this happens far before anybody is old and sick or whatever. So there was an opportunity that I had with my daughter. She created it. I was at her house and it was just the two of us and no one was home. My daughter has 4 children, her own business, she's married, and 2 dogs. She has a big heart. So one day we were on the sofa, just sitting there, and she starts to cry. I mean, sob. Now, my daughter's young. She's in her 40s. Her children are all, there's nothing happening here in this scene. Everything is fine. And she's sobbing. So I said nothing. And she said, you know, Mom, someday you're going to die. And now she goes on and she's sobbing. And someday my husband is going to die. And look at those cute dogs over there. They're going to die. And God forbid if anything should happen to my children. And maybe my business is going to go under. And she's in full-blown grief. I remember looking at her face, and it was very hard to see her cry this hard. And I remember struggling with myself, and I said to myself, shut up, and don't tell her everything's going to be all right. And sure enough, all I did was say, that is the truth, Bonnie. That is true. And then it freed her up to grieve some more. I never told her it was going to be okay, that everything was going to be fine. And then when she was finished with her sobbing, she just gave me the biggest hug. It's all she needed. There wasn't anything I could say, and it would have been inappropriate for me to tell her everything was going to be all right.
That took a lot of emotional maturity.
Oh, I had to, when we were done, I had to go somewhere else and I let it out. And she will never know how difficult that conversation was. It was the best thing for her. It was the best thing for me, but I had to manage that moment like nobody's business. And I will never forget that incredibly beautiful moment that I had with her.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a great example. And it's also a very practical example when our children call us up and they're upset about something. And our immediate tendency, or at least my immediate tendency, is to give a piece of wisdom and give a prescription of what they should or shouldn't do. And almost every single time they do absolutely the opposite or nothing at all. And then you're so upset you don't sleep the next night, but then you wake up the next morning, you're so worried about them, and you say, how are you doing? And they say, oh, everything's fine. Why wouldn't it be okay? Oh my gosh, the gray hairs. So let's
Right.
see, I'll look at some other questions. So as a caregiver, how can I be constructive with the grief and anger I'm feeling about a parent who is still living?
Well, sometimes the anger is justified. I mean, they're doing goofy stuff, no doubt about it. I think we have a right to be angry, and I don't deny when I am angry about somebody doing something that is destructive to the well-being of themselves and myself, and whatever ripple effect it has. Again, I ask questions. It is not my job to judge how they're negotiating the world. But what I try to do is help them be accountable for their behavior and their actions. So I might say, do you not think, Dad, that you're going to the casino and throwing away your money has any effect on the rest of us? What kinds of questions can we ask? Do you believe that driving is in the well-being for everybody here? What evidence do you have that your behavior is not affecting anyone but you? Questions, questions, questions. Keep in mind, we're the child anyway. We're the kid. So in that situation, we're one down from the parental role. So we may not be the best person for the conversation anyway. Maybe an authority figure might be better. But when it's a spouse or when it's a sibling, we've got to figure out other ways to be effective. And the only way I know how is to ask questions. The minute we feel judged, right? What do? We put our hands up and we say, get out of here. It's my life, not yours. Mm-hmm. So asking questions, little ones in the beginning, if that's what it's going to take, and being the influencer to ask the questions. If I'm not the right person for the job, I'm out of there. I get somebody else to do it.
So that's such a great answer. And even more, the idea of asking questions, I think, is really insightful. And I need to do that more in future situations with friends and family. I think that's a great idea. And the one topic we really haven't talked about is, how do we keep the person's memory alive in the moment, and then after they've died. And I was going on my Instagram this morning, and I learned that today is the Day of the Dead. What is it? Dia de los Muertos. I didn't take Spanish as a kid, but I mean, it's such a coincidence that today is this day that it's a traditional Mexican holiday, and it's the day they believe the souls of the dead return to their living family members. And, you know, the way I truly feel that Laura is still with me, I think of her almost more often on a daily basis than perhaps I think of my living children. I mean, she is there with me in every cell of my DNA. And her memory changes as I get older, and as I know she would have gotten older, and as her siblings relate to her in a different way also through their memory. So I think that there's really a lovely way that even in the process of people, you know, declining in health, we can figure out ways to, whether it's recording their voice or asking them to tell their story or figuring out what type of funeral they want, and really giving control to the whole situation so that you're not inching away from the idea of their impending death, but you're acknowledging it. And I think sometimes we avoid asking people to like share their life story because we are afraid of what that subtext means is, oh, I know you're going to die one of these days. But it's not like they don't know that they're going to die one of these days. You know, it's like when people would not mention Laura's name after she passed away, right? Like, I didn't forget that she died. You know, they might be worried that they were going to make me cry in the moment, but it was like, I'm thinking about her 24/7. All that I know is that she now has become the elephant in the room. And the fact that you won't mention her name is really making me mad and making me uncomfortable. So I would have to bring up her name myself.
Yes.
So,
well, that's how afraid we are to talk about anything related to this. We go to our comfort level first, where, but we also didn't go to school for this. We don't have the language necessarily. We don't have the role models. For those of us who have had role models, I come from a big Italian family where death became, you know, the funeral was a big family event, and there's lots of over the dinner table. You know what Uncle Joe would say about this, and you know, just like this food, you know, things that just make us bring it into the room. We do this naturally, but not all cultures do that, and so if you were at my house, Susan, you would hear Laura's name left and right. As soon as somebody would hear about it, we would be all over it. And others would be like, no, we're not going there.
No, I mean, I think it is in those stories and jokes and telling the story of someone's life and the memories, it does keep that person alive in a way that it's very hopeful. And I truly believe that she is alive just by me doing what I'm doing.
Absolutely.
And so go on.
Well, you bring up a good point. So this has to do with people who want to talk about their impending death. They could be very healthy, but they want to talk about death. They want to talk about their plans, and people around them say, "Oh, no, we're not going to go there. You're going to be fine." And so it's a two-way street. Being able to be successful in opening up the can of worms.
Exactly. I think we could continue this conversation for many hours, but I know that I know you wanted to share something from one of your books, and then I wanted to just wrap up really quickly and put some links in the chat that could be helpful. So why don't you read a little excerpt, and then we'll go do some more of the housekeeping that I think you'll want to stick around for.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. So this comes from the Complete Elder Care Planner. And I wrote something in this book for everyone on the call who is a caregiver, though I didn't know you. But I would like to read this to you because every morning I say these words to myself. We don't choose elder care. Elder care chooses us. The caregiving journey will take you to places unimaginable, and in the process, you will learn more about yourself than ever before. You'll laugh when things are sad. You'll cry when things go well. You realize that life will never be the same again. You won't come away from the caregiving experience the same as when you started, nor will you look at life and death in the way you did before. The simple truth is this: our elders want their lives to be validated, and they do not want to die alone. Go to them as best you can. Elder care wakes up the soul and serves as a daily reminder of what is ultimately important in our lives.
It summarizes our conversation so well. Thank you. I really appreciate your generosity in sharing your wisdom today. And what I will be doing after this is sending all of you the Zoom recording. I have your emails, and please feel free to share the link with anyone else that you feel might benefit from our conversation. I'm going to be having another Permission to Thrive conversation in January. And I'll probably be announcing who that will be in December. So, sort of stay tuned for that. And I'm going to be putting in some links that are about how to keep in touch with Joy and potentially purchase her book, how to keep in touch with myself. I wrote my memoir, Permission to Thrive, which goes into a lot more detail about my daughter, as well as some of the other crazy things that have happened in my life. And I'm also putting in a link to a short video called Laura's Gift of Life. We didn't get to talk about it today, but it's a professionally done 5-minute video of the fact that Laura was an organ donor and her liver saved the life of a woman in upstate New York. And that has been a very special connection and really healing aspect of our journey. And so that is Laura's Gift of Life on YouTube. And just for preparing for today's conversation, I Googled 2 days ago anticipatory grief, and the second thing on Google was Anderson Cooper's new podcast called All There Is. And the topic was anticipatory grief, but all of the things that he has put together are just incredible. And there's actually one of his topics was with Stephen Colbert, and they were talking about grief. And I have not heard that one yet, but I've heard it's highly recommended. So people are talking about these topics more and more. And I think whatever we can do to talk about these ideas, to talk about organ donation, to talk about how do you be resilient and how do you choose how to respond to life's bad events, the healthier we'll be as a society. So I think with that, we'll say goodbye. And I just appreciate all of you coming on today and keep this kind of thing going. Thank you, Joy, too.
Thank you so much for having this conversation. You broke through a mold, Susan.
Excellent. Excellent. I like that. I like that. Like breaking a mold. Okay, that's great.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And please feel free to keep in touch in whatever way works for you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Susan. Bye, Joy. Thank you.
Great job, Suze.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
You're welcome.
That was quite awesome, you two.
Thank you.
Loved every minute of it, Susan. It's Brenda. Then Brenda.
Thank you, Brenda.